Now I'd like to turn the presentation over to our other EPA presenter, Chris Chapman, who will be covering batch data submissions and submitting data to AQS.
Sure.
Here you go, Chris.
All right, yeah, and I think we'll also have videos. So I'm just going to bring the slide up on my other monitor so I can see it. So this, you can tell this slide is old because it talks about the new batch form, which we've, I believe, had for 6 or 7 years. So basically what we're going to talk about, I'm not going to read everything on the slide, but we're going to talk about how you get data into AQS, whether it's raw data or QA data. And essentially what that usually involves, or the example we're going to show, is you have to submit it to a separate interface called the ENSC, the Exchange Network Service Center, or CDX, Central Data Exchange. It's basically different names for the same thing. And that was an effort that the EPA started roughly about 20 years ago to offer people one central interface for submitting all kinds of environmental data. And as you'll see in the example when we go into it later, it's not just air quality data, but there's services for water quality data. There's literally, I think, 600 or 700 services that are encompassed under the ENSC. So you literally upload a file along with some metadata that you type into a form to the ENSC. We have a back-end process that puts that into AQS and then runs it through the AQS business rules for what kind of data it is, i.e., to see that, for example, you put the right tribal code on it or the right parameter code, or that the method on the monitor is correct. And then essentially what AQS does with that information is for those pieces of information, those transactions that are valid, it moves them into the system and makes them production ready. And for those that are not, it keeps them in the staging part of the system, and it sends a report to the submitter that says this is where these pieces of data failed. And then we have a process in AQS called correct, and then the user can correct those pieces of data and go back to the batch form here inside AQS and resubmit the job until all the pieces of data are in a given file are accepted. So this is the batch form. You get to it when you log into AQS by clicking batch, and then at the top of the menu, and this is the primary form that you'll interact with when you load data of any kind of AQS. So we can go to the next slide. This is a long flow chart, and this flow chart is also on the batch form itself. It's kind of an old school IBM flow chart with different, not the triangles, but the circles are sort of the pieces of data, and then the decision points are the diamonds. And so you can see this just walks you through it. You load the file into the ENSC. It stages to AQS. There can occasionally be errors with the ENSC. If there aren't, then it loads, and then you can see there, if there are load errors, then you go to correct. If there are no load errors, then it goes to raw data. If it's not raw data, then you're done. If it is raw data, there's an additional step called post. We'll talk about in a second. And then you can see there's the different reports, and there's things that look like rectangles with wavy lines for the bottom, the load summary and errors, the stat CR, the raw data inventory. We can go to the next slide. And now we're going to show the video. And Michael, I believe that's Michael King. I believe that's something you do, right? So I will defer while we watch the video, and then I'll pick it back up.
Batch submission is loading a batch of data records all at the same time. Advantages of batch loading. Batch loading allows for mass entry of data. Processing of valid data happens without human interaction. The system notifies the user when the process is complete and provides the user with results detailing the outcome. There are two types of formats that may be submitted: AQS transactions, the AQS pipe delimited transaction format introduced in 2001, and XML structured text data with tags. This flowchart will help explain the data flow to AQS. Step 1 of the flowchart is to create a file of ambient air data. Step 2, transfer the file to AQS using the Exchange Network Services Center. There are two process control options from the Exchange Network Services Center. Option 1, manually process. Log into AQS, choose the screening group, and proceed to the batch screen. Option 2, automatically process. Use the Exchange Network Services Center exclusively, bypass AQS, and process all data via the Exchange Network Services Center. Step 3, stage, process the files into AQS. If there are no transfer errors, we move on to step 4, load. For anything other than raw data, the process is complete. For raw data, the load step also performs statistical and critical review. Next is step 5, post. Post moves data from where it can only be seen by members of the relative screening group to where it can be seen by any AQS user. It also updates all of the summary values that the raw data contributes to. This means that it will be used by EPA in any calculations. You should now have an understanding of the batch submission process. Thank you for watching.
You can go to the next slide. I think we've seen the video. Okay, so the Exchange Network Service Center. For those of you that came to the first webinar last week, we walked through how you register for the Exchange Network Service Center. And it is a separate system from AQS, and you have to have a separate user ID and password, which I know is not the most user-friendly thing. It is our hope as we migrate forward with AQS that we'll be able to address some of the issues that we bring up, some of the quirks and difficulties of using it. And we are starting to undertake that project because AQS is based on technologies that are sort of reaching the end of their useful life and support. So the way you get to the Exchange Network, you can go to the AQS database or the AQS website, epa.gov/AQS. You click on the Environmental Exchange Network to get from there. You can also get to it from the batch form. If you're on the batch form, there's a button that says go to the Ensc, and then presumably you will have already registered for the Exchange Network Service Center when you get to this point. So we're going to talk about what you do the first time you access it and then later times. So we can go to the next slide. So you log into the Ensc, getting to it either via the website or the button on the batch form, and you'll be presented with something like this. The first thing you want to do, the very first time you use the Ensc, is set up your Exchange Network service, the service you're going to use. Like we talked about, the Ensc has a bunch of services, so you want to make sure you get the correct one for AQS. The best way to do this is you can search for a service and you type AQS, click the search button, it'll come back. The one you want is the AQS submit, and the node is NGN prod 2. That's the main, I mean, you can see different states have set up, like New Jersey and Wisconsin have their own nodes. I don't know, I'm sorry, I didn't look at this. I don't know if there are any tribes that have their own node or if they just use this node that we've set up for everybody that's used by most folks. And so you click here, on the send info button, then we go to the next slide, and you'll be presented with something called an Ensc upload form. You can only load one file at a time. That is something we've gotten requests to fix for a long time, and we just have never gotten to it, so that you could say send a zip file that had 10 different files in it, and then AQS would process each of those 10 files. But right now, there's a limit on only one file at a time. Now that file can have different transaction types, and it can encompass data from different monitors. The challenge you run into, I think, with one file is that obviously if you have errors, the bigger the file, the more likely you are to have errors. When you have errors, right, the transactions that are valid go into AQS, but the ones that don't, the ones that have errors fail, and so I think it's more work in that sense, and it's just more work, right? So we'd like to make it easier, and as we go forward with AQS, we're gonna try and do that. So can you go back one slide, because I haven't really talked all the way about the form stuff, I don't think. The submit acknowledgement, thanks. So you click on browse, and it will search your PC for the document you want. You'll upload that, you put in your email. It says optional. I almost always put in my email address. Your AQS user ID, so you need to know that. Usually it's 3 characters, not always these days. So you'll need to know that. The screening group, which we've talked about with AQS, and then the file type, the final processing step, and whether you want to stop on an error. So, and the defaults are yes and post. So for the final processing step. But and I did want to talk for a second about the processing steps really quickly. So there's 3 steps in AQS here. these 3 steps only apply to raw data. Essentially, QA data doesn't have the post load option. It's you're either going to stage it or load it. So when you stage data into AQS, that means it's been moved into AQS but not evaluated against the AQS business rules. When you load it, that means it gets evaluated against the business rules, and if it passes and it's QA data, then it goes into production status. And if it fails, you get a report back telling you what the failures are, and it stays in stage. And then if it's raw data, if it's loaded and it's past the business rules, it's in this weird state where it's in AQS, but it's what's called pre-production, meaning only you can see it, the submitter or somebody in the submitter screening group. And so then you have to take an additional step with raw data to post it, which essentially just flips the switch in AQS, moving it from pre-production to production. That still confuses me, especially since we handle it differently for different kinds of data. But it's important, I think, to understand what those different things mean. So we can go to the next slide now, and I'm sorry. So you hit that send data button and you get a submit acknowledgement form. You get a very human readable transaction ID, which is probably worth taking a screenshot of sometimes if it's a big file. I believe they put that in the email you get sent, although I'm not 100% sure about that. So then let's go to the next slide. And so this is what it looks like. If you go into the Ensc, you can click on there's a button there called My EPA Activity, and it will show you all the files you've loaded, show you the document name, the transaction ID, the service you used, and then it will tell you how many data rows got loaded. This example clearly comes from our daily check because every day we load a file into AQS that we know has data that will fail, that will have errors. So this just shows you that. So in this example, yeah, the rows all got into AQS, they got staged, but none of them loaded because they all failed whatever business rule was being applied to them. And so that's why it says number of transactions with a load error. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, and yeah, and so this is the Ensc download page. And this just shows you the document. So if you clicked on that transaction detail, that hot link that was in the previous page under transaction ID, you'd see this. And so then you have load reports and other documents associated with the transaction you could see, and it would tell you what happened again. So this is from a different job, but it gives you an idea what happens there. And so let's go down one more slide. Okay, so the next time you log in to the Ensc, all the services you've used will show up under this My Services tab. So like I said, there's the My Services tab, there's the My EPA Activity tab, which we just looked at, that shows you, all the files you've loaded, and the My Services tab. So next time when you come into the Ensc, you don't have to look for a service. You can just click here where it says NGN test2 AQS submit, and it will bring you back to that submittal form, with the file name and the AQS ID and the screening group and all that. So we can go to the next slide. Okay, so we're gonna watch a video now that I think will probably explain this far better than I did, and then we'll go on to the rest of the stuff.
Using the Exchange Network Services Center to submit files. Files can be processed through the My Services Center interactive window. After logging into the Exchange network, you can select the My Service Center tab or click the Go button on the interactive window area labeled My Service Center. To send data to AQS, you will select the service name ending in AQS Submit. You should also verify that the service description shows AQS Submit: send files to the Air Quality System, AQS. Clicking the service name link will open up the Express Request AQS Submit form. The Browse button allows you to choose a document from your local computer or network. Here, you can enter one or multiple email addresses. Multiple emails must be separated by commas. The file transformation information will be sent to the email address you input into this field. In this field, you must enter your AQS user ID. Click the arrow to open the drop-down menu. Then select the screening group that you are submitting data for. Open the drop-down and select the appropriate file type from the drop-down menu. Note, AQS transactions are flat files. Click the arrow and open the drop-down menu. Here, you will provide AQS with instructions on how far to process the file before stopping. Stage copies the data from the submitted file into the AQS database, but does no processing of the contents of the file. If an error is reported during the stage process, the problem must be fixed in your data file and then resubmitted. Load moves the submitted data into the AQS database and performs field validation and relational checks. If errors occur during the load process, you can fix the errors in AQS via the correct forms, or you can correct the problem in your own database and start the process over. Post is for raw data only. Post changes the status of the data from where it can only be seen by members of your screening group to where it can be seen by any AQS user. Click the arrow to open the drop-down menu to select either yes or no for the stop on error processing command. Select yes to prompt AQS to examine the results of the stage and load programs, and stop any additional processing of the file if there are any errors or warnings in the data. Select no to prompt AQS to process all the data it can through the final processing step selected. After you have entered values for all of these fields, you should click the Send button to begin the AQS submit process. The Request Received screen will appear. This screen will display your status and a transaction ID. You are now able to successfully submit data to AQS through the Exchange Network Services Center.